My talk tonight is entitled McAlester Valley Grand Visits, Few and Far Between. I wrote an article for our spring issue of the Scottish Rite News listing the visits of sovereign Grand Commanders to McAlester in the past. Of course, the article was prompted by the upcoming visit of Commander Seal to our temple next week. I accumulated more material than could be used in the article, so I decided to present it to you tonight. But it does make for pretty good, interesting local Masonic history, and it helps to keep the spotlight on our most important event in the immediate future is the arrival of Sovereign Grand Commander Ron Seal in just a few days. So let me ask, how many here tonight read the article referred to? Okay, that's to you, I need to make an apology and correct an error. The article mentioned that there had been only 6 previous Grand Commander visits, which is incorrect. I have found another official visit, and to be truthful, I wouldn't be surprised if another 1 or 2 should surface as I continue to pursue this matter. We will now take a look at the first visit that we had here in McAlester by a Grand Commander, and it was by Grand Commander James D. Richardson. As mentioned in the article, the date is somewhat in question. It was either 1904 or 1905. If we recreate the scene, we find Richardson in Little Rock with a delegation of Supreme Council members making a tour out west to the valleys of Little Rock, Guthrie, Wichita, Kansas, and St. Louis. Now, I won't go into detail, but the reason which is unusual for the Grand Commander to bring a delegation with him from the Supreme Council on his visits. But he did this time, and there was a purpose, because the SGIG in Oklahoma, Harper Cunningham, the first SGIG that we had, was strong advocate for theatrical type presentations of the degrees. And as you'll recall from previous talks we've had, that was not the norm. That was the new thing. Now, the northern jurisdiction had been doing it pretty regularly, but southern jurisdiction, because of Pike, he was very solidly against theater type presentation, and of course that stopped us for a good while. But this was just, and it had never been authorized by the Supreme Council, but it just had popped up. So they were doing it kind of outside, and Richardson was a proponent, but he knew that the Supreme Council was still so conservative that he was taking them around to these places in the West that had adopted this new type thing to try to get them on his side so he could get it through the Supreme Council. Anyway, in the book 100 Years of Scottish Rite Masonry in Guthrie, written by Bob Davis, the story proceeds as follows. After visiting Little Rock, where he was met by Harper Cunningham, Richardson made a side trip to South McAlester, a small town of some 5,000 inhabitants in Indian Territory, where a delightful breakfast was served. Cunningham had arranged a brief visit to the new temple there, and after a reception of a half hour, the delegates boarded the train and journeyed on to Guthrie. So this was a pretty short trip. This was just a breakfast visit by the first Grand Commander, and the new temple in 1904 had to be the wooden building that we had, because it was new in 1904. So the 1904 date actually is better supported than the 1905 date, even though we had another book written by Bob Davis mentions that 1905 was the time when that took place. Also, the temple I mentioned had to be the wooden building fronting on Washington Street. Now, the second visit was also by James D. Richardson, and let me remind you of Richardson right now about how high esteem he was held even to this day by historians. He was a member of Congress from Tennessee when elected Grand Commander, and he held both positions, a member of Congress and the Grand Commander, for 4 years. After 20 years as a congressman, and he resigned his position. I presume at that time that was adequate for retirement purposes, and then stayed on as the Grand Commander for the rest of his tour, which was 10 years. So he had a tour of 14 years altogether. He is hailed, and the reason he's held in such high esteem is that he's hailed as the originator of the New Age magazine, now the Scottish Rite Journal. He was a promoter of theatrical degree presentations, as I've just mentioned, but the big one was he was the planner and the builder of the beautiful House of the Temple that we have right now. In his first visit, Commander Richardson saw our quite primitive wooden building in 1904. His second visit, 3 years later, was to dedicate what McAlesterites call our first real temple, and that is the 3-story red brick building. At the second visit, 1907 visit, the dedication we had 700 members, a new temple, and a great future. The dedication reunion was in April of 1907, and this was 7 months before statehood. So we still were in Indian Territory officially. Unfortunately, Richardson died in 1914, a few months prior to the completion and dedication of the House of the Temple, but he's still given credit for being the builder and planner for that. If Richardson had lived until 1920, he could have seen the progress of the little town in Indian Territory with the wooden building progress on to the 3rd largest valley in the southern jurisdiction. I've run onto this souvenir reunion and dedication of the temple quite elaborate program, which I've passed around to you all. Commander Richardson's second visit was much more formal than the little breakfast visit of 3 years previous. Let me read from, I've already paraphrased some of this, but let me read from the 1907 Transactions of the Supreme Council, in the words of Richardson himself, his account of this visit to McAlester in '07. I left Savannah April the 19th for South McAlester Indian Territory by rail by way of Memphis, Tennessee. At the latter place on my arrival, I was met by brethren of the 33rd degree and some of the officers of the body there, and with them spent the evening of the 20th conferring as to the best interests of the Rite in that section. I reached South McAlester in time for the reunion, which was to begin on Tuesday the 23rd. On the preceding night, a reception was held in the new temple, which was being completed in time for this meeting. And after the reception, the 3rd degree, that of the Master Mason, was regularly conferred on a candidate by the worshipful master of the local Blue Lodge, who, by the way, was William Perry Freeman. Let's see, where was I? The brethren of our Rite had wisely chosen this method of opening and inaugurating their new temple. They had, so he was approved. He approved of this, which was another innovation of Cunningham, by the way. The brethren of our Rite had wisely chosen this method of opening and inaugurating their new temple. They had provided a large number of scenes and stage settings for the special purpose of illustrating and exemplifying the work and ritual of the master's degree. The Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of the state was in attendance, and the capricious auditorium, that was his description of McAlester's red brick building auditorium, the capricious auditorium, which will hold about 800 persons, was filled. The audience being composed not only of members of our Rite, but also of the Blue Lodges. Of course, this was for that first night when they exemplified the Master Mason degree. This temple is one of the largest, most costly, and best arranged buildings in the southern jurisdiction. It is finished in the most modern style and is filled with the best and most expensive furniture. For beauty of construction, for convenience, for the working of our degrees, and for elegance and comfort in every respect, it is equal to the very best anywhere. It stands on an elevation in this little city, away out in Indian territory, a monument to the Masonic zeal, energy, and industry of our Scottish Rite Brethren. The leading spirit among them being our brother William Busby, 33rd degree, Deputy of the Inspector General Cunningham, to whom great credit is due for the erection of this temple and the condition of the rite in the territory. The class was very large, numbering about 175 members. The consistory is a new one and was regularly consecrated by me on Tuesday evening, April the 23rd, in which work I was efficiently assisted by brothers Cunningham and Brown. And then he says he goes on from there to Nashville. So that was I just took this out of the transactions of the Supreme Council of 1907. The third official visit to our city, was the one that I missed when writing the article. John Henry Coles was elected Sovereign Grand Commander in October of 1921, and in one of his very first travels as the #1 Scottish Rite Mason, he came to Guthrie on February the 14th, 1922, and then on to McAlester the next day. A banquet was held at the Busby Hotel by the 33rd degree McAlester Masons. Thereafter, he was escorted to the temple, where he spoke to a full auditorium of Masons. His visits were all one-day stops on this trip, so he left the next day for Texas. Commander Coles returned to McAlester in November of 1933, and I did get this one in the article, for the fall reunion of 1933. Then this made the fourth grand visit. The Great Depression was in full force by 1933 and taking its toll on membership nationwide, but it certainly was taking its toll no greater than in Oklahoma. 2 reunions were held that year, with 11 candidates in the spring, and then in the fall, when Coles was here, we had 12. This total of 23 candidates still stands as the second low for McAlester Valley in a year. John Henry Coles served as Grand Commander for 31 years. This tenure tied Albert Pike for the longest period served in our highest position. He died in 1952. McAlester can say that the first 4 visits by a sitting Grand Commander were by Richardson, 2 by Richardson, and 2 by Coles, who have been judged by history, as mentioned before, as the greatest producers in the #1 position, along with Albert Pike. Now the 5th and 6th visits were by Grand Commander Luther A. Smith, who was a lawyer and judge in Mississippi and a member of the Supreme Council for years before his election. His first visit to McAlester was during the November reunion of 1957. At that time, we had a class of 112 in the reunion. General William S. Key was the SGIG, but unknowingly was nearing the end of his career because he died 13 months later, and Charles Rosenberger at that time took over. The 1957 reunion was unique in that in attendance to honor the Grand Commander, listen to this was really amazing. 1957 reunion, in the attendance to honor the Grand Commander were both U.S. Senators from Oklahoma, Robert S. Kerr and Mike Monroney, and 3 of Oklahoma's 6 U.S. representatives, Carl Albert, Ed Edmondson, and Tom Steed, all members of the McAlester consistory. In those years, membership in Masonic activities was a necessity for politicians. Unfortunately, times have changed. Commander Smith's next visit was just a one-day stop on his way to Guthrie on March 31st, 1966. John Birch, at that time in '66, was our General Secretary. John told me he served from 1961 till 1990. So Commander Smith and his wife, actually the entourage was 3 people. Commander Smith and his wife and the chauffeur who drove the limousine, because they were making this tour by automobile. As a side note, the SGIG apartment was built under the orders of Charles Rosenberger, which had prompted much discussion and controversy at the time. Now, this is where Grand Commander, he was the first Grand Commander to stay in our apartment that we have down there right now. And of course, many of you recall, because I do, the discussion and controversy at the time of building that. Some people were against it and some were for it. Now, the black chauffeur was housed in the small room just to the south of the Rose-Croix Temple, which is now called the Secretary's Room and the Lecture Room, if you recall, where that's located there on the west of the building. The chauffeur is an interesting story. His name was Frank Simpkins. He was hired by Commander Smith in 1962 and retired just last fall, September of 2012, after 50 years with the Scottish Rite. He had served under 4 Grand Commanders, including Commander Seal. Commander Seal wrote an article in the July-August, I passed it around to July-August Scottish Rite Journal about the 50-year career at the House of the Temple. The article indicates that Frank had many other duties just besides driving the limo. Anyway, back to the 1966 visit. Since it was not during a reunion, Secretary Burks arranged a reception at the temple for Mr. and Mrs. Luther Smith, and over 200 Masons and wives attended. The 7th visit was by Grand Commander to McAlester was C. Fred Kleinknecht at our October reunion in 1998. I am sure many of you were here and remember this visit, so I won't go into too much detail. Our SGIG at the time was Paul Million. It seems that Paul and Kleinknecht had established a friendship which actually went beyond the normal relations between a member of the Supreme Council and the Grand Commander. They were really good friends. Paul's health was beginning to fail, and Kleinknecht was very concerned with Paul's pulmonary problems. And the truth of the matter, I think that's the reason he visited in 1998. And if you'll recall, 2 years later, Paul died of that problem. So that's the 7 visits that we have had, and our upcoming Ron Seal visit will be the 8th. When any chief executive visits one of the outposts which fall under the control, it is a major occasion. President of the United States visits a state or a city, it's a big deal. Governor comes to town, there are proper protocol to follow, and the red carpet is always rolled out. In a like manner, when the Sovereign Grand Commander makes a visit, either official or a casual visit, it's still a big deal. I hope that my last 2 talks as orator and the article in the Scottish Rite News will all have helped to emphasize this, the 8th visit to McAlester in 112 years of operation. And we need to greet him with appropriate numbers. Thank you.